Hello, everyone, and blessed be. I thought I would try something a little different. I'm here in my pillow bed on the couch, kicked back, and I know a lot of us are stuck inside, and it's good to be inside. It is a good help, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but I thought about doing some videos, for people to watch. And then I thought about one that has been requested for quite some time from a few people. And I do apologize, I'm not a professional reader. I'm going to have to take a sip of something, and I'm going to fumble words and things like that. But I thought that I would read you one of the books I wrote. It's not published, but it is copyrighted. And I did start this series 10 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. And I had probably about 40 people read it, and it kind of got a following. I had an author's page on Facebook, and that kind of just fizzled out and didn't go anywhere. But I thought it might be fun if I read from my story. It's my own. It's my own copyrighted story, so I don't have to worry about anybody claiming copyright problems or things like that. I'm only going to do a stint of the reading, and then I'll post it. And if people aren't interested or doesn't get enough likes or stuff like that, I won't do another video. I just thought it'd be something. You kick back on your couch, I kick back on mine, and I just read. And so this series the genre is young adult. Probably chick lit, young adult. But the people that I did have, they were called my pre-readers, were 99% female. But they ranged in ages from 11 to 60. So if it's vampires and werewolves, and if those things aren't your thing, then you're probably not going to enjoy this. But I just wanted to offer something different. Again, I will post this up, and if it doesn't go anywhere, then it doesn't go anywhere. But the series is the Reina series, Reina. Reina is the name of the main character, and it is about werewolves and vampires in a young adult kind of genre. So the first book is just called Reina, and this is chapter 1. "Where are you?" I mumbled under my breath as I paced the wooden floor of my room. My eyes moved to the digital clock near my bed, to the large window, and then to the door. Where was he? Werewolves were a pain in the butt sometimes. I should know. My closest friends were werewolves. Vampires, on the other hand, were pompous, arrogant, pretentious, and rarely any fun to be around. I should know. I am a vampire. Then again, I'm also part werewolf. So either way, I guess I'm knocking my own race. In our world, mixed races were referred to as hybrids. Not terribly unique in this day and age, but it was better than some of the other terms. I'll admit there were always exceptions, and my life here at the manor left my options for companions very lean. But, for the most part, vampires bored me to tears, if I had the ability to shed any, that is. I stood in front of my window looking down at the perfectly manicured garden, the moonlight reflecting off the pond, making it look almost magical, like black silver. The rain tapped against the glass, and I laid my finger on one drop, following it down in a choppy line, where my reflection and I watched it disappear over the edge of the glass. Yes, vampires have reflections. I looked at mine and tucked one side of my jet black hair behind my ear. I had my father to thank for looking so much like the stereotypical vampire in the movies. Jet black hair, nearly black eyes, pale skin. Well, we all had pale skin, compared to humans and werewolves, that is. My ears picked up just before someone knocked on my door, but I kept my gaze out the window. looking past the garden to the forest in the distance. It was no more than a dark, walled sentry that stood silently between the gardens and the world beyond, but it called to me. Another knock, harder this time, and I sighed, looking over my shoulder. "I'm coming," I called out, and then turned back to the rain-splotched window. I lifted my eyes to the tree line one more time, then turned and moved slowly across my room. I kicked a pair of shoes out of the way, knelt down and tossed a shirt onto a chair, and then reached for the doorknob. I wasn't usually so grumpy. In fact, I was a very happy, energetic, well-adjusted shut-in that lived with a loving but overprotective father. I chuckled at my own expense. Yeah, these meetings always put me in a bit of a funk. Michael smiled at me, though only with his eyes. "Your father is waiting, Reina. Your guests have arrived." "They are not my guests," I wanted to say, but there really wasn't any point. Either way, I had to go down there. So, I would sit with my father as he entertained these vampires from who knows where, while they talked about things I couldn't care less about. He had attempted to brief me, but I lost interest as soon as he said they were coming. Did I mention I wasn't usually so moody? I stepped out into the hall, then turned, sneaking a final peek towards the large picture window before slowly shutting the door behind me. Hopefully he hadn't completely forgotten. Ander was in the hallway as well, and both men loomed above me, even though I was not what you would consider short at 5'8". They were both muscular, handsome vampires, and they were my bodyguards. Yes, even vampires had them. At least the higher-ranking ones did. For some it was just for show. But my father's rank made mine a necessity rather than an accessory. So, in the spirit of the moment, I walked slowly, as if to my doom, which is what it felt like. I even amused myself by humming a melodramatic tune until Michael's look silenced me. My father was one of the oldest vampires in existence, and very respected. He was on the High Blood Council and outranked only by Mr. Turst, who was rarely ever seen or heard from, to the point that some thought he had either died or was just a legend. So, my dad was basically it when it came to the vampire world. His friends were usually fellow council members or those that held enough territory or power to matter in his mind. Don't take that wrong. I love my father dearly, but he did believe in ranks and stations and didn't mingle with those he felt were not in his class. "What will we have in common, sweetheart?" he had laughed when I asked him about it. Other than that, though, he was amazing. I stopped at the top of the staircase, glancing down, my hand resting on top of the polished banister. I heard Michael chuckle, and I shot him what was meant to be a hard look, but ended up looking like a plea for help. Ander cleared his throat, and I rolled my eyes. All right, I'm going. Ander and Michael had been with me for a very long time. A vampire rarely ever admits their true age, but we had seen this world change together a few times. We did age, contrary to most stories the humans like to write about, just very, very slowly. As my feet reached the bottom, I looked around, and a small smile betrayed my determination to be resentful. I did love this place. When I closed my eyes, I could recall every inch of it. Some vampires became fixated with a specific point in time and surrounded themselves with things from that era. My father, however, was eclectic, and our home was like a walk through time. We had antiques that dated back thousands of years displayed right next to the newest tech fad. There were oil paintings by famous artists hung next to computerized frames that never displayed the same picture twice. "Reina," came a soft but deep voice. I blinked and then huffed, which resulted in another chuckle from Ander, who spoke very little around others. Finally, I squared my shoulders and headed towards one of the living rooms. The manor had 3. One was private for those that lived here, which was only me and my dad unless we had close friends staying for extended periods of time. The other was for very formal guests such as higher council members. This one, though, was for the important but not too important guests. I smiled. The interested... Yeah. The web of the vampire hierarchy could boggle the mind. The hallway seemed much shorter than it was, and before I knew it, Michael was stepping up to one of the large doors. I shot him a pained glance, and he winked. I put a hand to my stomach and wished I could feign some sickness, but unfortunately, we didn't get sick, at least not in the human sense. At times like this, I actually envied the fragile creatures. When I stepped into the room, my father stood from his high-backed leather chair and smiled at me. Several other people stood as well, but I locked my gaze on him and walked forward. He met me halfway, smiling softly, knowing how much I hated these things. His dark brown eyes did offer some comfort as they sparkled down at me. Did I mention that I dearly loved my dad? I smiled up at him and took his hand. Thomas Beldren, my dad, was extremely handsome, and that is not just a doting daughter's prejudice. He was as tall as Michael and Ander, nearly 6'3". His jet black hair had the slightest hint of gray at the temples, which only added to his striking features, which were definitely GQ worthy. He gave my hand a soft squeeze and then turned. Andrew and Michael took up their positions near the door, and I hid my smile. The manor security was so thorough and high-tech that no one had breached it in my lifetime. But vampires did love their routines and rituals. Not mystical rituals, they just liked things a certain way, and oftentimes took simple things and turned them into complex ceremonies. I guess that's what you did with your time when you had so much of it. We walked up to the first couch, where 4 vampires now stood smiling at me. There were 3 men and 1 woman, all about my father's age. The men wore expensive suits, and the woman had a beautiful but appropriate dress, dark blue in color. I didn't hear their names, I droned that part out, but I smiled and nodded as we were introduced. My mind drifted, and I wondered if the package I had ordered had arrived yet, and if Track really had forgotten. "She's even more beautiful than the rumors, Thomas," the woman sang, beaming a smile in my direction, and then offering a bigger one back at my dad. I bit the inside of my cheek. I knew that look. She was single and hungry, but not for blood. Looks aside, it was my father's title that most of them craved. I'd never seen a completely unattractive vampire, though. We weren't made that way. The ones that were turned morphed, like a caterpillar, into a beautiful creature void of a pulsing heart, but with flawless looks and a hunger to feed. There were varied degrees of beauty among them, but as my dad always said, not everyone has the same definition of beauty. I blinked as he nudged me, then nodded to the men in turn, flinching as one eyed me longer than the others. I shifted under a stare. My father chuckled and then walked me over to the second couch of the waiting predators. 2 more men and women, these just a bit younger, although one appeared older than all of them. It was their smell that told me their undead lifespan. Not all vampires could do it, but I had a knack. Unfortunately, it wasn't anything more than a parlor trick, aside from having the thrill of knowing the one thing all vampires refuse to divulge. More nods and unheard compliments until my father turned me, knowing I was now on autopilot, and we stepped up to the single chairs. They were strategically placed at the front of the room, between the 2 couches. The chairs were almost throne-like in appearance as well. All the minds of the rich and undead. I sat to my father's right, and he winked at me. Catherine's daughter is here with her, and I believe she is the perfect companion age for you. I wanted to moan, but simply painted on my best fake smile and nodded. He chuckled, letting his eyes sparkle where only I could see. She's unpacking right now, but is very excited to meet you. The pretty woman that drooled over my father stated. When she sat a bit closer to the edge of the couch, still smiling, I realized she was waiting for me to reply. I look forward to meeting her, I replied, hoping I appeared somewhat sincere. Yes, I was the proper daughter of Thomas Beldren at these functions. I smiled when I should, spoke when I should, and attended some council meetings with him, for appearance sake. I never got to sit in on anything really important, but that suited me just fine. My father made sure that I knew the basics of the inner workings of our kind, but he quickly realized that I had less than no interest in the politics of it all. Antone's son will be here tomorrow, my father stated, gesturing to the man whose long stare had made me uncomfortable. I shot my father a look that said, "Please tell me he's a small child." But my father winked, which meant he wasn't. We have a minor state meeting this week, and they will all be our guests for a time. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to moan. My father was trying to play matchmaker. Again. His friends were always plotting to try to match me with their kin to get in with the family. My father was much more selective, but no less annoying with the task. The time ticked by slowly, as if to taunt me. I gazed across the room, watching Andrew and Michael. They stood alongside four of my father's guards, who actually made mine seem average, if that was possible. There were others around the manor, but these four were with him as much as Andrew and Michael were with me, which was a lot. I turned my head to the side, studying the features of those to my left, just for something to do. If we were human, we would at least have this monotonous time interrupted with food or even bathroom breaks. As it was, they simply talked, laughed, and chatted away, and I didn't hear a word. Finally, my father reached over and tapped my hand. "I think we have bored my daughter to stillness," he smiled, and they all chuckled politely. "Why don't you go say hello to Catherine's daughter, sweetheart? Perhaps you could take her on a tour of the manor." I would almost rather stay where I was, but I nodded and stood. The men in the room were quickly on their feet as well. Old habits from decades gone by were hard to break. I smiled and bowed my head. My father stood and kissed my cheek. "I owe you," he mouthed with a grin. After a quick kiss on the cheek and a few mumbled goodbyes, he walked me to the door. When it closed behind me, I let out a huge sigh and shook my arms. "You bet you owe me," I chuckled over my shoulder. "Catherine's daughter's name is Allison," Michael explained as we headed towards the guest wing. "She's a bit of a teatop." My steps slowed. That was our slang word for a stuck-up vampire. It stood for tiara top. Vampires that walked around like they had a crown on their head. I wrinkled my nose. Maybe I'll meet her tomorrow. Andrew grinned, but Michael gave me a look, and I nodded. Fine, let's get this over with. I was supposed to go to tracks tonight, and if I'm leashed to a T-top, who knows when I'll be able to leave. Track was my best friend, and was a full-blooded werewolf. He lived with his pack in Polson, the town on the other side of our estate. I envied his freedom, relative to mine, that is. He lived among the humans to a point, and was able to walk under the blinding sun. Unfortunately, that's one of the few things humans got right. Vampires couldn't go out in direct sunlight. We didn't burst into flames and instantly turn to ash, or start to bubble and ooze in a pool of goo. The reality was not as dramatic, but the results were just as fatal. Sunlight would kill us by literally cooking us from the inside out. The remains did reduce to ash rather quickly, but not in an instantaneous event. It was much slower and painful process, and yes, we could feel pain. We have nerve endings and a brain to register the sensation, so why wouldn't we? Now, we did have a higher tolerance for it. That one I can't explain. Except, maybe if you know you're going to heal, the pain seems less important. And I'm going to stop there. And if you guys enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. Please comment down below if you would like to see any more. And I'm going to put this up and see what happens. Hope you enjoyed.